Iran's endeavor to gain full status as a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been approved after about 15 years. Approved by all permanent members of the organization. Full membership will mean substantial leverage and clout in the Eurasian alliance for Iran. In recent months, Iran and China have been working on a wide-ranging, long-term political, economic and security accord that would inject hundreds of billions of dollars of investments into the Iranian financial markets and infrastructure. Iran has been also exploring a similar long-term pact with Russia. Political leaders in Tehran perceive these actions as a necessary means of overcoming U.S. hegemony and economic terrorism. According to geopolitical analysts, a convergence of interests is bringing Iran, Russia and China closer together than ever before. Iran earlier signed a multi-dimensional 25-year strategic treaty with China and is prepared to do the same with Russia in the near future. Now, this country has ascended to the SCO. This can be seen as a third decisive move in Iran's inclination towards the East. I'm Leila Faramarzi and you're watching Iran Today. In this episode, we'll be assessing Iran's membership in the SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran's, so to speak, new strategy of becoming a pivot to the East involves developing dynamic economic, political, military and security alliances with Eastern giants, basically China, India and Russia. This approach has gained all the more credence among Iranian officials since former U.S. President Donald Trump's misguided move of withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, and his conducting maximum pressure policies towards Iran. Whether membership to the SCO and long-term deals with China and Russia can actually serve as Eastern equivalents to the JCPOA, our expert explains. Mr. Hadidi is the Iran-China Chamber Board Director. I'd say he's got a pretty good sense of how deals with the East might pan out for Iran and its economy.
به نفع کشور ماست که با
It is in our country's interest to work with countries in the world that have a future and, more importantly, are energy consumers, because fossil fuels are expected to run dry in the not-so-distant future. We have a couple of decades to make the best use of our underground energy resources. India and China are the world's two greatest importers of fossil fuels. Iran and Russia are two countries with the richest underground energy resources in the region.
Sure enough, Iran has found receptive collaborators in the East. Tehran, Moscow and Beijing oppose the U.S. military and interventionist policies and seek to eliminate the supremacy of the U.S. economy in the Eurasian region. This is not to say Iran will be amplifying tensions and foregoing relations with the West. The SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which grew from the Shanghai Five Pact, was established in 2001 by the leaders of China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The aim was to balance multilateral security and economic and cultural cooperation, aiming at balancing US and NATO influence in the Eurasian region. Mr. Moradian is PhD in international law and advises the MOD, and he came down to the studio to tell of security benefits Iran's upgraded membership could have for this country.
سازمان میتونه در آینده
Shanghai Cooperation Organization can create a defense and security alliance in the future. It has not reached that convergence at the moment. The reason being the heterogeneity of the member states. The member states now have economic and political disparities. So we cannot expect their organization to become a NATO-like regional defense organization in the short term. Maybe this will happen in the future, and Iran at that time could use a lot of these benefits of the organization.
The SCO permanent and non-permanent members are the world's largest producers and consumers of energy, with an area of about a third of the Earth's land surface and about half of the world's population. with strong potential to balance power and create a multipolar world. Question is, will Iran's permanent membership to the SCO be an equal win for Iran and the rest of that organization?
We shouldn't ignore the realities of the organization. We think that the organization can help us improve and solve the problems caused by sanctions. But this is not the case. US sanctions are aimed primarily at private institutions and international financial institutions. None of these countries and no international organization in the world can force the private sector to cooperate with us and guarantee that it will not face US sanctions if it enters into a financial transaction with Iran. And no organization or country will ever enter this game. It could even be a trap for Iran if it enters into discussions with countries on this issue, because they can get good economic concessions from Iran and give nothing back to us.
Both political and economic factors are of concern in analyzing Iran's membership. Hostility and the ongoing US sanctions system have always restrained the development of Iran's international trade, depriving it of the benefits of external markets or foreign investment for financial and infrastructure projects, for example, transportation and communications. But sanctions have mainly impacted tourism and oil and gas industries. Now, in hoping to alleviate this problem, Iran is looking to the east, because Iran is an energy power after all. Mr. Vafai is a China affairs analyst and university professor.
یه نکته‌ای که وجود داره درباره نگاه به شرق این هستش که قرار نیست ایران
One thing about looking east is that Iran is not going to ignore the West. As the name of the approach suggests, Tehran will be looking at the east, that is establishing a balance in the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. We've always witnessed Iran's foreign policy swaying from favoring the east or the west every time a new government takes power in Tehran, an issue that isn't in the country's interests. The concept of looking at the east must be approached with caution so we won't turn into jumping to the east's arms. We need to look at the west too. Looking at the east shouldn't result in turning our backs on the west. As a matter of fact, looking at the east can only benefit us when we can create a balance in our foreign policy to have ties with both the west and the east.
Iran, Russia and China have actually discussed de-dollarization of their trade for decades and have considered launching an alternative to the SWIFT global network, SWIFT standing for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Talking of Iran's permanent membership, after the technical and legal process concludes, which could take up to 2 years, Iran will formally join a group that accounts for exports worth trillions of dollars annually. That's because SCO includes China, Russia and India, in addition to several Central Asian and Eurasian states. How do you see Iran going about making the most of its membership, economically and security-wise?
ما مشکلات عدیده‌ای داریم در حوزه مراودات بانکی و مالی.
We have many problems in banking and financial relations. If these problems are not solved, all these things will fail. We have to deal with FATF. This is a serious issue and no organization or institution can address it. Iran cannot hope to resolve this issue with regional agreements, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or even other bilateral agreements. Because if there is a banking transaction to or from Iran, the FATF as a transaction monitoring body warns the other party that they are exposed to a serious risk in terms of money laundering and terrorism financing. Basically, if Iran does not solve its problems with the FATF, it will lose the opportunities it can get from membership in the Shanghai Organization, among many others.
Iran's new president, Ebrahim Raisi, has not been the singular leading figure in this country's foreign policy decision-making process. But he is part of an establishment that laid out the central contour of the next phase of Iran's foreign policy. And his government will have to pursue this path, the path of displacing the JCPOA as the focal point of our foreign policy. Addressing the recent SCO summit in Dushanbe, Raisi said, "When I took over the presidency of the Islamic Republic, I introduced my foreign policy orientation as focusing on economic multilateralism, strengthening relations with neighboring countries in its broadest sense, and strengthening presence in regional organizations." He then called for strengthening bilateral cooperation in order to improve the strategic role of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the global economy. Iran owns the world's second-largest natural gas reserves and the fourth-largest oil reserves, which position it as a significant actor in the strategic calculations that Eurasian powers make in their foreign policy toward the Middle East or West Asia. For instance, by strategic collaboration with Iran, Beijing and Moscow would have a unique opportunity to redirect both Iran and its regional rivals toward the China-Russia-Eurasian strategic construct.
آمریکا و چین
The US and China might be heading into a confrontation in the Asia-Pacific region. It's likely, and we've seen some of its signs with the latest trilateral agreement between US, UK and Australia, that military lines are being drawn there. In such a scenario, the Persian Gulf countries will have to navigate routes through straits like Taiwan, which will be very unsafe to sell their oil to China. Iran and Russia are the only two energy-rich nations that can sell fuel to China through pipelines.
In line with the US's failure in wars on Afghanistan and Iraq and its partnership with Saudi Arabia in attacking Yemen, it has become clear that the United States no longer functions as the dominant superpower in West Asia. Traditional allies of the US are in profound crises and their positions are particularly weakened. Also, the US withdrawal from international treaties such as the JCPOA have seriously called into question the legitimacy and credibility of that country, unlike China. Would you say Eastern countries are uniting as opposed to the West?
به هر حال کشورهای شرقی دارن در قالب سازمان شانگهای و زیر
Anyway, Eastern countries are uniting under the banner of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But it's important to remain realistic. The member states are not at all seeking to challenge the world order. They're not trying to stand against NATO and declare themselves the opposite number at all. While they accept the international system's order, they're introducing themselves as another potential pole alongside the others. I've read in some analyses that the West is scared now that Iran's a permanent member of the Shanghai Organization. It's not like that.
Apart from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there are other similar regional organizations too, like the ASEAN, which is an important one, or the D8 and others. Japan, South Korea, and even Australia are members of some of them. A few months ago, a treaty dubbed RSAP was introduced in the region, in which Australia, India, ASEAN nations, China, and others clinched an economic pact. I don't think it would make much difference. Geographically speaking, what are we considering nations like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines? Are they Eastern or Western nations?
There's plenty more of our narrative coming up, but first let's give other media outlets a chance to have their say. Here's how those other outlets put it in words. IntelliNews tells of how Iran's options, alternatives, are a reality. Iran's economy less troubled than Washington would like and turning to the east. The words Iranian economy and collapse are presently so closely linked in the media narrative that the imminent collapse of Iran has become one of those truths that hardly needs stating. The numbers, though, tell a different story. U.S. strategy towards Iran, whose objective is to topple the Islamic Republic by fomenting mass dissent among the poor and unemployed using sanctions as a catalyst, looks like being as successful as U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. Iran, whose economy is demonstrably considerably healthier than the consensus suggests, and much healthier than some major economies we could mention, has been driven firmly into the China-Russia camp, where it will prosper. To add insult to the self-inflicted injury, those barrels of oil will not be traded in US dollars but in yuan, another step in the slow but steady de-dollarization of world trade, which is already ringing alarm bells in the offices of longer-sighted US strategists. Trapped by their own rhetoric, the US, Israel and the E3 are probably now too late to prevent Iran from becoming a firm member of the Sinosphere with an economy that is stubbornly refusing to lie down and die. The Atlantic Council tells of how the situation in Afghanistan might have led to Iran's ascension to the SCO. With the US out of Afghanistan, Iran jumps on the opportunity of joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Since the United States pulled out from Afghanistan, there has been much speculation that China stands to benefit. The logic appears to be zero-sum. The US has left, so China will jump in to fill that space, bringing Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and Beijing's growing sphere of influence in Central Asia. There are good reasons to be skeptical of this line of thinking. For starters, China and Afghanistan are not natural partners. At the same time, the manner in which the US departed Afghanistan could lead to Eurasian alignments that are not in Washington's interests, especially where Iran is concerned. Full Iranian membership would certainly benefit Tehran. Any international acceptance is welcome news for the Iranian government. That China and Russia lead the SCO is another plus, providing Iran with great power support in its ongoing struggle with the US. Moscow's consistent calls for a polycentric world order and Beijing's for a more democratic one are consistent with Tehran's concerns about US power. It also builds upon the momentum from the China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Can Iran's membership to the SCO hold the West hostage? The Tehran Times reads, ex-ambassador, SCO membership will force the West to provide facilities to Iran. A former Iranian ambassador to China and Russia has said that with Iran's permanent membership in the SCO, the West will understand that the space for Iran will not be limited. The comment by Safari comes as Iran has been subject to sanctions by the West, especially after the former Trump administration quit the 2015 nuclear agreement and slapped the harshest sanctions in history against Iran. The member countries of the organization are noticing that the foreign policy perspective of Raisi's administration is more focused on neighboring countries, Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS countries, and Asian countries in general. And for this reason, they have welcomed Iran's permanent membership. That would be it for this segment. Do stay tuned. Another regional issue that will have a serious impact throughout Eurasia has to do with the recent developments in Afghanistan. The Taliban have once again taken over the war-torn Afghan nation following the withdrawal of American troops. China, Russia and Iran have blamed Washington for having created such a chaos in the region, as they believe America withdrew without cleaning up its mess. The SCO countries now have no choice but to come together to stave off Afghanistan's impending humanitarian crisis that could lead to a new regional refugee crisis and provide fertile ground for terrorist activities of militant groups such as Daesh or ISIS.
ما در نظام بین الملل امروز شاهد یک جریانی هستیم.
In today's international system, we are witnessing what can be described as a depletion of the potential for power from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is a fact that all countries are aware of. Even the Americans themselves have Japanese and British think tanks arguing about this. The developments that are taking place in the region all indicate the same thing. We also witnessed the events that took place in the
As it would seem, as far as Iran is concerned, its membership in the SCO would enhance its soft security by enabling it to better manage the chaotic situation in neighboring Afghanistan. Ehsan Arkani, a member of the Planning and Budget Committee of Iranian Parliament, is of the opinion that the Shanghai Pact is one of the most important treaties in the world, and Iran's membership will break the siege and economic sanctions, which would mean an expansion of investment in various infrastructural and industrial dimensions, because Iran can now more freely use the markets and industrial technologies of major SCO member states that in turn need Iran's oil and gas reserves. Iran is keen on advancing the Iran-Afghanistan-Uzbekistan corridor, which connects cities like Mazar-e-Sharif and Herat directly to Iran's Chabahar port, which has Chinese interest in it as well. Iran has a coastline of 2,040 kilometers with the high seas in the south, and if Shanghai members use Iran's infrastructure to increase transportation capacity, there will be interests common to all members, especially China and Central Asian countries that do not have access to the high seas. In other words, Iran, with its unique geographical location, can serve as a north-south and east-west link in the SCO. Of course, achieving this goal requires the expansion of transport infrastructure.
One reason is that the Islamic Republic's diplomacy inside the SCO reached a point where the member states no longer considered Iran's presence in the organization as a threat. The other issue is striking a balance. With the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, as you mentioned, there would be a significant vacuum in the equations of power in the region. To restore balance and fill the vacuum, we need new equations in the region. Certainly, a new security plan in the Middle East, Central Asia and Southeastern Asia won't work without Iran. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization accepted Iran as a member state in its bid to form this balance, considering the regional security necessities.
Another opportunity for Iran in joining the SCO is to enhance the country's position internationally, say in the Vienna talks to revive the JCPOA. Today, to say nothing, 2 of 9 member states of the organization, that's China and Russia, have veto power in the UN Security Council. Mr. Moradian finds some official takes a little simplistic, however.
In today's modern world, what constitutes power, unlike in previous decades when defense and security defined power, is the economic issue and the country's shares in the global trade. In this regard, permanent membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization can help Iran in order to remedy the economic, trade and mainly political challenges. The SCO is very significant politically.
The enlargement of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Iran's permanent membership can also be analyzed in the context that the Chinese and Russians are somehow trying to deepen their economic and political cooperation in West Asia.
China and Russia are the most influential members of the Shanghai Organization, and we have very good relations with them. In my opinion, China is more prominent than Russia in the Shanghai Organization due to its leading role. The Islamic Republic can define common interests with different countries such as China, Russia, and India, or with individual countries such as Russia and China, or based on its priorities in the form of the Shanghai Organization.
Less has been said on Russia's interest in Iran's full membership to the SCO. First, that if the JCPOA is revived, Russia's attraction would be reduced as an economic and security partner for Iran. Second, perhaps Russia is trying to turn SCO into a more viable regional security organization and in this way compete with NATO. If so, having Iran, which links Central Asia to West Asia, would be a good gain for Russia. Finally, media executives in Iran are hoping that in line with its rapid expansion, the SCO will recognize the need to establish a media union for its members. That'll be it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. And remember, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook via @Iran Today Show. Bye for now.